Thanks for visiting Timeless Audiobooks. Please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe for our latest audiobook uploads.
Section 1 of Whispering Tunnels. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. Part 1. For the second time since his arrival in Paris that day, Miles Cresson of New Orleans found that wartime comrades would flee at the mention of a name. There was something so sinister in the way they had stared and made off whenever he uttered it that the American was seized with astonishment. It was not strange, then, that he paid little heed to the carefree students who crowded past on Boulevard Saint-Michel that August evening in 1923. Cresson watched the gray-blue uniform of Captain Emile Debray until it had vanished in the crowd, determined that he would demand an explanation should they meet again. For insolence had shone in the officer's small eyes and in his pasty face, as his back had turned in answer to a civil question, and that question concerned the fate of a fellow officer, Jules Chamon. It was mystifying. Debray, an Alsatian, was both oily and ingratiating, and it was because of this that Cresson had disliked him from the first. The three, Cresson, Debray, and Chamon, had been artillery students together at Laval d'Hon in 1914. Cresson was one of those valiant, impetuous Americans who took up the cause of France in the beginning. He was the wealthy and adventurous scion of an old Louisiana family, with the twinkling black eyes of his ancestors, one of those tall, dark, good-looking chaps one often meets in the Southland. If he had ever held a barrier of reserve between himself and Debray, Cresson did not know the existence of this, so far as Chamon was concerned. They had been the closest of friends, drawn together by interests in common. Jules Chamon reminded one of steel encased in velvet, having the blue eyes and tawny hair of a Viking, and yet the gentle features and intensity of a prophet. Indeed, he and Debray were opposites. They differed as much in appearance as in tendencies, of the sort that had caused the stocky Alsatian to fling away his patrimony over gaming tables a few days before their paths had crossed. Fluency in languages had cemented a bond between Chamon and Miles Cresson, whose accomplishments in music and art were much the same as those of the young Frenchman. The fortunes of war sent them into different regiments before they had quite completed training. Cresson to the defense of Paris, Chamon and Debray to Fort Vaux near Verdun. Letters at first were frequent, but as the war on those from Chamon ceased abruptly, and efforts to locate him failed. Cresson, recovering in a Paris hospital from wounds received a few days before the armistice, discovered that Jules Chamon was missing in records at French Army headquarters. Further inquiry at the Invalides disclosed nothing more than the addresses of his nearest relatives, a mother and sister. Neither could be found, nor did anyone seem to know just what had become of them. In Paris, the mansion of the Chamons was shuttered and dark, while at L'Isle Adam, the crippled caretaker of the chateau had seen none of the family since the war began. Cresson put further inquiry aside and began a long cruise on the Mediterranean to regain his health. Upon his return to France, Cresson made a tour of the battlefields near Verdun, where he discovered that Chamon's name affected French army officers in peculiar fashion. They either turned the subject or walked away when he tried to question them. He gradually became conscious that an invisible wall barred all facts, except that with regard to Chamon's disappearance in 1917, when the German legions overran Fort Vaux. If the attitude of the garrison's commanders had puzzled the American, that of Debray, the last man questioned in Paris, aroused hot resentment. For the stocky Alsatian, perhaps, was best able to clear the mystery, and yet had refused. Cresson pondered over this as he walked slowly up the boulevard, until at length bright squares of light from the terrace of the Café des Trois Ponts crossed the pavement. He stopped suddenly, as a voice from the terrace called his name. He turned to behold a smallish, well-groomed man, wearing a close-cropped mustache, racing after him. The runner was hatless, and his gait endangered his spectacles, which dangled from his waistcoat by a ribbon. A casual observer might have classed him as an American college professor on tour, but to Miles Cresson he was Dr. Arthur Littlejohn of New York, scientist and spook hunter. Dr. Littlejohn, recovering his breath, looked closely at the younger man and frowned. "If I didn't know better," he exclaimed, "I'd say you are uncommonly blue for a resident of the Latin Quarter. You're worried. I'll see you home and try cheering you up in the bargain. Wait here." When the scientist emerged from the cafe with his hat, the two hailed a taxicab and rode in silence to a secluded hotel in Montparnasse, a short distance away, where Cresson maintained his quarters. His apartment, in fact, might be better described as a small museum. The walls of the great living room were covered with rare paintings, armor, tapestries, and ancient weapons from the corners of Europe. Dr. Littlejohn sank into the depths of an easy-chair, an unlighted cigar between his teeth, noting silently his host's nervousness and lighting a cigarette. Cresson broke the silence with the story of Chaumont's disappearance, and the unwillingness of French army circles to discuss it. "There's something about all this that is very mysterious," declared Cresson, resting his gaze on a jade clock high above on the mantel. "There may be no answer to it, Doctor, but if there is, I feel that you are the one man able to find it." The scientist acknowledged the compliment with a quick bow, sinking deeper into the chair with his elbows braced on the arms, and the tips of his fingers touching. His eyes alone, peering above the gold rims of his spectacles, betrayed keen interest. "What I have told you," Cresson continued, "occurred in Fort Vaux, which lies between Forts Douaumont and Hardimont, in a circle of strongholds defending Verdun. All told, there are 36 fortresses, some of them from 4 to 5 miles apart. The whole region is a succession of bare, desolate hills, scarred and pitted like the surface of the moon, a labyrinth, honeycombed with death. I can tell you, Doctor, no living man knows the extent of that vast underground network of tunnels and passages linking up the forts. There are layers of these stone arteries which run in every direction, all connected with innumerable flights of stairs. The main tunnels branch off into hundreds of smaller ones, which lead to countless great rooms, barrack halls, dungeons, and almost bottomless shafts. Trapdoors and inclines descend to the bowels of the earth, and these have doubtless accounted for many of the men that have attempted to explore the tunnels, and have never emerged again. Torches, maps, and compasses seem of little use, for the armies of the earth could well be swallowed in the immensity of this maze. 3 nights ago," the young man went on, "I arrived in the little village of Montcourt, which is about 4 miles east of Verdun, on the Paris-Metz railway, and just outside of Fort Vaux. Rain was pouring, and the road from the station to the solitary hotel resembled a river of mud. The inn had been boarded up and patched in spots where enemy shells had left their marks during the war, and I considered myself lucky in getting a room that was fairly dry. I donned dry clothing, and after a very excellent dinner, I adjourned to the buffet for coffee. There were few persons there, but among these I recognized an old friend, Major Paul Falaise, commander of my battalion on the Aisne. He appeared greatly surprised but overjoyed to see me. The major had remained in the army, and for the past 2 years had been stationed in Fort Vaux. The gloomy fortress had a depressing effect, he told me, and this he had attempted to offset by habitually strolling into the village of evenings. Good old Falaise simply wouldn't adhere to my staying at the inn, insisting that I go to Vaux that night as the guest of the garrison. It was really a short walk to the fort, although the steep incline of the road made the buttressed entrance seem more distant than it actually was. Falaise dropped no hint as to the identity of the commander when he suggested an introduction, and I received quite a surprise when I walked into his headquarters. There I saw a short, active man with prominent eyes and a bristling mustache, writing furiously at a desk. He proved to be Colonel Marcel Dupin, Papa Dupin, as he had been known at Le Valdehon. Papa Dupin leaped from his chair to give me a greeting such as only an ecstatic Frenchman can give. His gestures were many. "Zounds, my dear son," he cried, embracing me. "So you have come to visit with us? Superb! In the name of the fort, I welcome you." I laughed and told him that it was indeed a happy surprise to find so many of my old comrades in one spot. The evening passed very pleasantly in the garrison club room, where the younger officers crowded around after dinner, asking eager questions about Paris, particularly the Folies Bergeret, Montmartre, and the Bois. All seemed suffering from the monotony of garrison life, and eager to talk on any other subject. Major Falaise at bedtime asked permission to conduct me to my quarters, and together we started along the corridor to a distant wing in the parapets. Above the echo of our footfalls, a far-away soughing as of wind in the thick foliage of trees, intermittent and long drawn out, sounded in my ears as we continued. When I asked Falaise about it, he started perceptibly. "It is the whisper of the tunnels, my friend," he told me in a low tone. Falaise, I noticed, seemed trying to pierce the gloom ahead. His eyes were staring as if momentarily expecting something to appear in the corridor. But the next minute he had recovered himself. "La, it is nothing, only the wind," the major added with a shrug. "So, let us go on." He led the way, but my curiosity rose to such extent by the time we reached the guest chamber that I asked him point blank about the mysterious whisper. His reluctance to talk of it was plainly apparent. "When we hear the whisper, someone dies," he explained. "That is what the troopers of the garrison say, but mind you, these fellows are a superstitious lot. The sound has been heard only since the war, and it is audible only at night. I myself believe it is only the wind playing in some breach in the passages. Mate, when the enemy shells destroy the portion of her, do not let it trouble you." The major changed the subject, chatted for a few minutes, then bade me good night. The guest chamber proved to be a large, irregular room, built into the grim, dingy stone. It was neatly furnished, however, and very comfortable, with its rugs and the log fire blazing in the great fireplace. There is considerable chill in the air of the hill country in August, and the warmth of the flames was very pleasant in that atmosphere of damp rock. The room was so large that the rays of the lamp failed to penetrate the black shadows of the opposite corners and walls. I took up the lamp and made an inspection of the chamber. In the corner farthest away from the fireplace, dark red curtains covered the doorway of an anteroom, which I dimly discovered was shaped like a pepper-box. As I peered through the parted curtains, it seemed that I again heard the long-drawn whisper rise and die out. I listened intently, but it did not come again. I returned to the fireplace, convinced that my imagination had deceived me. Somehow a feeling of depression assailed me from the moment Major Falaise stepped from the door. Try as I would, I could not rid myself of a gloomy foreboding, a brooding apprehension that left me cold and tensed. I fell to wondering over the lives of the men whose calling forced them to stay in this gloomy fortress for years, and in my heart I pitied them. I finally arose from my chair facing the log fire and locked the door. I next extinguished the light and climbed into bed. I must have been asleep for an hour, I think, when I awoke. Shadows were scurrying everywhere in the dim light of the fire, and the whisper of the tunnels, now loud and ominous, seemed hovering in the corridor just outside the door of my room. I tell you, I fell to trembling violently when I felt a rush of ice-cold air from the corridor as the locked door swung open on noiseless hinges. Something was coming through that door, something I could not see. My heart thumped, as if trying to leap from my chest. I tried to cry out, but the sound stuck in my throat. I was powerless to move. My limbs seemed paralyzed. In some manner, I sensed the presence of some malignant person who had entered the room. I could feel it coming closer by inches as I lay there waiting. The glow of the fire dimmed suddenly and then went out altogether, leaving the chamber in inky blackness. A sound like the whirring of many bats seemed everywhere, filling both the corridor and the chamber, where it seemed that a gray, shapeless mass was slowly changing outline and moving in the direction of my bed. I had just enough strength to pull the covers over my head in a frantic effort to shut out the sight, but no sooner had I done so than something akin to a chilling blast tore back the bedclothes. In terror, I perceived that something, aglow with a pale phosphorescent fire, was hovering over me. It took definite outline, and then I saw the face of Jules Chamont. It bore the pallor of death, but his large eyes seemed alight with a gleaming, burning expression of one who had borne the suffering of the damned as they peered beneath the rim of a trench helmet. His uniform was that of an artillery captain, and his boots trod the floor noiselessly as he passed from my bedside toward the fireplace, and then to the wall a short distance to the right. When his hand touched the stone, a heavy block loosened and fell crashing to the flags. His arm groped the hollow space left in the wall, but he shook his head sadly and moved away, circling the chamber. My fears left me, for I was sure that Jules was in some trouble and needed my help. I rose from bed and followed him to the anteroom, but as I stood between the parted curtains, he turned and sank through the stone floor. Panic seized me, for now I was convinced that I had seen an apparition. I leaped across the chamber in an effort to escape, but as I reached the door it closed with a bang. I saw the key turn and heard the lock snap to, by what means I do not know. Again I heard the whisper. A great black mass was barring my path, a foot away, and gazing at me fixedly with eyes that were living balls of flame. A horde of soft flopping things struck against my body and face, and two steely tentacles shot out from the mass and seized me by the throat, choking my head backward. I found myself gazing into the most horrible human face I have ever seen, huge, fat, loathsome, with long fangs in its hideous yawning mouth, and its forehead beaded with greasy, fetid perspiration. I struck the thing's face again and again, and in a desperate struggle tore my body free. End of section 1. Section 2 of Whispering Tunnels. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 2. I must have fainted, for I awoke lying on the flags in the center of the room, with Major Fillets chafing my wrists and neck. He had found the door wide open when he arrived there to summon me to breakfast. The Major was much concerned over my haggard appearance and insisted that I see the garrison physician without delay. I objected, saying I had suffered merely a slight indisposition which would soon pass. Major Fillets started violently when I told him that Jules Chaumont had visited my chamber. He made no comment, but wheeled and hurriedly left the room. His attitude was puzzling. One look about the guest chamber convinced me that my experience had been no dream. The stone block rested where it had fallen on the floor, and the hollow space it had left in the wall, I found, was really a secret vault. It appeared to be empty, but in running my hand over the bottom, I found a photograph of a young woman. I did not examine it closely, but put it into the pocket of my overcoat. I dressed, but was too shaken to eat the excellent breakfast served in the clubroom. I visited Colonel Dupin, anxious to find out the history of the great chamber, and had launched into the story of the night before when I mentioned the name of Chaumont. Papa Dupin instantly froze in his attitude, but I knew that my story had made a profound impression. He would not permit me to complete it. "My boy," he replied, raising his prominent eyes, "do not speak in riddles, and do not ask irrelevant questions. I am very busy this morning, and must really ask you to excuse me." Thus rebuked, I determined to leave Fort Vaux then and there. And I did leave, angry and crestfallen. I was engaged in packing up my belongings at the inn in Montcourt, when a rapping sounded on my door. I opened it to face Major Fillets. My greeting must have been frigid, for he began an apology at once, pacing the floor nervously. Twice he ran to the door, flinging it open suddenly as if in fear of eavesdroppers. "You knew," he asked, "that Lieutenant Moret, the pleasant young Breton whom you talked with at dinner last evening, is dead? No? His body was found in bed this morning, and that look of horror on his face, I shall never forget it. Naturally, finding you on the floor this morning unnerved me. The whisper." Then followed a tale of strange happenings in Vaux. The Major, his voice sometimes sinking so low that it was almost inaudible, told me of the pledge taken by every member of the garrison not to reveal these tales outside of the fort. Spectres so frightful had appeared that neither officers nor men would venture into certain parts of the fort alone. The tunnels were shunned, as if the demons of the universe were centered there. Fillets recalled numbers of the men who were found dead in the plague spots of the fort, apparently of unseen horrors. 2 lieutenants, he said, had recently gone mad on different occasions in the guest chamber where I had spent the night, under circumstances that were almost identical. And the eyes of both shone the light of insane terror over something they had seen and were attempting to escape, when found crouching and muttering. The guest chamber had been occupied by Chaumont and Debray during the war. Falaise said he obtained this information from a chart in the records. None of the officers now in the garrison had served with either of the 2 men, nor, with the exception of the colonel and himself, had known them. He had merely heard of Chaumont's mysterious disappearance, the German attack, and of Debray's transfer to Paris headquarters after the armistice. Of what actually happened in Vaux during the war, he knew nothing, so far as regarded Chaumont, except that an order from headquarters forbidding mention of his name was in effect throughout the army. Falaise admitted the order was a strange one and could not recall an instance where a similar taboo had been issued. Yes, he had seen the spectre of, he whispered it, Jules Chaumont. The major regarded that as strange, because there was never any record of his death. Others who had spent the night in the guest chamber had seen the apparition, but other things encountered there at the same time had frightened them too badly to observe it in particular. Falaise told of seeing it once in the tunnels, and another time in the destroyed wing of the fortress. "It was not my intention," the major said in bidding me goodbye at the station, "to have you spend the night in the guest chamber, but officials arriving unexpectedly from Paris left me no choice. There was no other room, and I profoundly regret that you suffered such an experience. I shall see you in Paris soon, I hope." He shook my hand through a car window and stood gazing at the train as it pulled out. "Now, Doctor," Cresson concluded, "you know the whole story. I arrived in Paris today and walked the boulevards for hours before I could make up my mind to come here. The matter is a complete mystery to my way of thinking, but of course you might not face any difficulty in unraveling it. Was it Chaumont in the flesh, or was it a phantom which I saw in the fortress?" Little John reflected for several minutes before making a reply. "There is no doubt in my mind," he said, "that you saw the spectre of Jules Chaumont. But in doing so you ran afoul of other phenomena, far more dangerous than apparitions. You spent the night in one of the worst haunted spots in Europe, and it is fortunate that you emerged as safely as you did. The black mass you describe may have been either an elemental or an intelligence that never existed in human flesh. In plain words, a demon. Now, I think I am not far wrong when I say that the spectre of Chaumont would have shown you the key to this mystery had it not been interfered with by a host of powerful entities which must have literally filled your bedchamber. These elemental forces must be exorcised, or the fate of Jules Chaumont will never be known. But such a step must be undertaken by a trained psychic, because anyone else would be overpowered. It is no wonder you fainted." "Will you undertake this, Doctor?" Cresson asked, leaning eagerly forward from his chair. "I feel it is my duty to go on with my search for Jules." "Yes," replied the scientist, "I will do so. First, I must think the matter out and map out a course of action. I cannot say just when I shall be ready." "I'll wait here in Paris until convenient," said Cresson, thanking Little John. "Ugh, it seems I can hear the whisper of the tunnels in my dreams." "By the way," exclaimed Little John suddenly, "let me ask what you did with the photograph you found in that guest chamber." The younger man emitted a low whistle of surprise. "By George," he replied in a startled tone, "I had forgotten about that." He stepped quickly to his wardrobe and lifted a tweed overcoat from the rack. "Here it is," he exclaimed, drawing forth a mud-stained photograph. "Let me see it," the scientist requested quietly. Cresson passed over the portrait in silence, waiting for Little John to speak. The doctor examined the likeness minutely. "This is one of the most beautiful women I have ever seen anywhere," he mused admiringly. "I wonder what she has to do with the haunted fortress. Hello, here's an inscription." Both men, bending over the photograph, saw written in a lower corner, "To my dearest Jules, from Audrey, Paris, March 16, 1917. 3 weeks before the fort was taken, exclaimed Cresson. "I wonder who the original could be, or what she could have meant to Jules Chamont." He glanced at the doctor expectantly. "These are among the things we must find out," Little John answered. "But I think as you do there is a connection somewhere. Did you visit the Bureau of Secret Documents, where you made inquiry at the Invalides?" The scientist peered over his glasses as he asked the question. "No, doctor," the young man returned. "I visited only Army headquarters. I didn't know of the Bureau then. I'll go there tomorrow." End of Part 2. Section 3 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 3. The two Americans crossed the great square of the Invalides the next morning, mounting the broad steps of the War Ministry. Once within the portals of the Bureau of Secret Documents, both sent their cards to the commandant and were presently shown before one of the chief inspectors, a grizzled lieutenant colonel. The inspector bit his lip and motioned for silence when they announced the nature of their quest.
"Zounds!" exclaimed the officer incredulously. "Can it be possible you speak of Captain Jules Chamont, who was once stationed in Fort Vaux?"
His eyes grew wide as Cresson nodded affirmatively. He pressed a button on his desk, and when the chief clerk responded, commanded that certain records be brought before him.
"It is forbidden to mention the name of Captain Chamont in the military service, except, of course, upon official inquiry here," said the inspector, opening one of the massive books of records, when the clerk had closed the door behind him. "Are you not aware, my friends, that Captain Chamont is posted as a high traitor in France?"
Cresson almost leapt from his chair in astonishment.
"A traitor!" he shouted. "That cannot be. Chamont was one of the bravest and best of men. He loved France," he broke off helplessly. "Nevertheless, monsieur," continued the inspector, placing his thumb on a page, "here is the order. He is charged with delivering Vaux into the enemy's hands on June 7th, 1917. It was a close secret, known inside the fort alone, that the French command had prepared for eventualities in blowing open the casements of Vaux. This was done to establish communication with the outside trenches, of course. But this information, together with orders, maps, and plans, was turned over to the enemy by a Frenchman in the fort. And witnesses say this Frenchman was Jules Chamont."
"Impossible!" Cresson burst out. "There must have been a mistake." The Southerner turned his eyes to Little John, who shook his head gravely.
"But no, messieurs," insisted the officer. "We are sure that the evidence was correct. We are sure that Captain Chamont is now hiding in Germany. Where, we do not know. If he had been made a prisoner, would he not have returned to France? For now the last of the war prisoners have been exchanged. If he had died defending the fort, the enemy would have buried him according to rank. Chamont has never been proclaimed a traitor in orders of the French army, because such a step might prevent his ever being captured. Otherwise, he might think it safe to return. Instead of a proclamation, the French government has taken an unusual course, banished his name in army circles. Of course, monsieur, he still holds his rank in the army, and will continue to do so until proven guilty by trial. The strangest thing, my friends," the inspector went on, "is the fact that no trace of Captain Chamont has ever been found. Our bureau men have scoured Europe without avail, and doubtless he is carefully concealed."
"Do not forget, monsieur," Cresson interrupted, "that this is but a theory. Why, Chamont was a tiger for courage. Would such a man place gold above his country?"
"Sacre, I do not know," replied the officer with an eloquent gesture. "One of the main witnesses before an investigating committee was a fellow officer, Captain Debray, who actually saw Chamont pass papers to a spy."
"Debray!" exclaimed Cresson incredulously. "Why, monsieur, this officer was Chamont's friend." He broke off, recalling the odd behavior of that officer on Boulevard Street, Michel, the evening before.
"Exactly," returned the inspector. "His friend. That is why the evidence is so overwhelming. Debray was reluctant enough to be sure, but country is above friendship, monsieur. However, if there is nothing else—"
"There is something else, my colonel," said Little John, "about Captain Chamont's mother and sister,
Could you tell me anything about them?" The little scientist had spoken for the first time, and his keen gaze was now riveted upon the Frenchman. "Ah, yes," answered the inspector. "They are living somewhere in Paris, but I do not know the address. The family estate was in the name of Jules Chamon as the male heir, and this was confiscated by the government of France, as is, of course, usual in the case of suspected traitors. For the sake of his mother and sister, I personally am glad there was no public proclamation. It is really tragic, this eviction of Madame and Mademoiselle Chamon from their homes. I recall seeing them here when they appeared before the investigators." Cresson started, recalling the darkened mansions and the disappearance of the two women. "Would this portrait describe either of the two ladies?" asked Little John, extending the photograph to the officer. The Frenchman seized it and turned the likeness to the light. "Sacre!" exclaimed the officer. "It is she. It is the daughter, his sister. Mademoiselle Audrey, I believe. But, messieurs, I've told you all that I know. I must now beg you to excuse me, for I have a conference soon." The inspector shook the hands of both Americans in turn, as they thanked him and departed. The two men agreed that a search for the two women would be necessary in discussing the new angles of the case. At the Café des Trois Ponts, they questioned several of the waiters, Cresson giving them a description of Captain Debray. All knew him as a frequenter of the place, usually dining there in the early evening and always alone. "One little thing that I can do," Cresson told Little John, "is to watch Captain Debray. Evidently this fellow has unlimited money, according to the waiters, and is spending it too. I'll shadow him, Doctor, for it is just possible that wine has loosened his tongue. If he talked—" Cresson's eyes conveyed his meaning. "A most excellent idea," Little John agreed. "In the meantime, I'll map out other work we have to do." The two separated. End of Part 3.
Section 4 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 4. Cresson, in the café that evening, was careful that Debray did not discover his presence. His table was screened by a lattice-work of vines, and it was behind this that the American saw his uniformed quarry swagger in. When Debray made his exit, the American trailed behind him like a wraith from the boulevards to the narrower streets of the Latin Quarter. He saw the Alsatian light a cigarette and then enter a gray stone apartment building. Cresson arrived at the entrance just as his quarry stepped into the lift. The Louisianan darted softly to a stairway behind the shaft, and crouched against the wall where he could command a view of the hall. 20 minutes elapsed when the silence was broken by the whir of the lift machinery. He heard the car descending, and voices, a man's gruff tones and the modulated ones of a woman. Persons bound for a theater or promenade, Cresson conjectured, for he could not see the occupants. The car grounded with a grating sound. The gates opened. Then a girl clad in deepest jet stepped from the car, followed by Debray. The sight of her features made Cresson gasp. It was the original of the photograph, only more beautiful, more ethereal in actual reality. A shadow of sadness shone from the depths of blue-violet eyes. She was slender, yet molded with the grace of a statue. Her voice was musical in its soft, lilting tone. To Cresson, standing there, she seemed a vision of gold and white. A painting stepped from its frame, endowed with life. Something in her bearing, a certain reserve, convinced Cresson that this fair girl tolerated the Alsatian's air of proprietorship because of some vital reason. Why did she even appear on terms of friendship with the accuser of her brother? What could she mean to him? These were the questions that the American then and there determined would be answered. He waited until they had gone before emerging from his place of observation, and then returned to his quarters, elated. He, at least, had found the Chamons. Little John and Cresson decided that no time should be lost in calling upon the family. Accordingly, the next morning, the two stopped before the door of a fourth-floor apartment in the building. Cresson rang the bell. The door opened, and a tall, stately woman, whose snowy hair resembled a coronet, faced them. "Madame Chamon?" asked Cresson with deference. "It is Madame Chamon," she replied. "Do you wish to see me?" "Yes, madame," Cresson replied, "if it would not be an intrusion. I wish to introduce myself as Miles Cresson, former captain of French artillery. I doubt that you have ever heard of me, but your son and I—" "Monsieur Cresson?" she exclaimed in wonder and emotion. "The same that my dear Jules wrote me of so many, many times? Oh, monsieur, it cannot be, and yet it must be. Will you not enter my poor dwelling? You dear messieurs are most welcome." "This, madame," said the Louisianian, indicating his companion, "is Dr. Arthur Littlejohn, who served France and her allies with distinction in the hour of need. He knows of Jules." The scientist bowed gallantly over Madame Chamon's extended hand, and the three moved inside. The elderly woman conducted her visitors into a small living room. The two Americans took chairs facing her when she had become seated. A slight rustle in the entrance caused them to turn in the direction of the sound. Cresson beheld in the doorway the golden girl of the night before, and Littlejohn beheld the original of the portrait. The two quickly rose as she entered the room and stood beside her mother. There was a surge of admiration within the breasts of both Cresson and Littlejohn, for the contrast of types was, indeed, one of noble loveliness. "My daughter, Mademoiselle Chamon," said the elder woman as she introduced the visitors. The girl responded gracefully, extending an impulsive hand to each of the men in turn. There was an aristocracy of breeding in her poise and in her features, from the gold of her hair to the delicate up-tilt of her chin. "I feel that I have known you always, Monsieur Cresson," she said. "Dear Jules spoke of you so often. Ah, monsieur, you were his best friend." Her eyes filled with tears, and her hands betrayed her intense struggle to hide the tumult of emotion. Cresson told the story of his search, careful to make no reference to happenings in Fort Vaux, nor of his visit to the Invalides. "His letter seemed to break off suddenly," the Louisianian concluded, "and I never heard from him again. No one seems to know just what happened to Jules after the Germans captured Fort Vaux." Madame Chamon was no longer able to keep back the tears. It was tragic to behold the grief of these two gentle women in their struggle for composure. At length, with an effort, Madame Chamon spoke. "You know," she said, "that he was accused of delivering information to the enemy, which resulted in the capture of the fortress. Accused of selling La Belle France, his country, to the Germans. Accused, I say, vilely and falsely of being a traitor. Believe me, messieurs, when I say that my fine, noble Jules could never be guilty of that. He died fighting for France. I feel it. And oh, if I could but clear his name, I would willingly lay down my life." "You have had much to bear," said Cresson gravely, "and both Dr. Littlejohn and I are anxious to clear the name of Jules Chamon. Of course, 7 years have passed since the enemy captured Fort Vaux, and time may have destroyed the proof we seek. We are determined, however, to leave nothing undone toward clearing up the mystery and restoring your estate." "Oh, monsieur," said Madame Chamon earnestly, "the estate matters not. It is the honor of my only son that I wish to clear. I did not dream that my Jules had an enemy in the world until Captain Debray, a man who pretended to be his friend, ruthlessly accused him of treachery. Oh, messieurs, that man, he cares little for the suffering of a mother and a sister. The gratitude will go with you in your quest." The Americans left the apartment, filled with a deep sympathy for both mother and daughter, planning speed in their search. In the 2 weeks which followed, they were almost daily visitors, and so eloquent that, finally, they overcame Madame Chamon's objection to appearing in quiet portions of the boulevards. The four would steal away to quaint restaurants and theaters off the beaten track. Dr. Littlejohn left for Moncourt, after winding up pressing scientific reports in Paris. He promised to wire Cresson in case there were developments in his plan, parts of which he declined to reveal. He merely asked the younger man to hold himself in readiness, should he be needed. "I should like merely to look over the ground in my own way," he told Cresson on departure. "When my investigation carries me inside the fort, I shall call for you. In the meantime, address me at the inn." A week after the doctor had gone, Cresson sat alone with Audrey Chamon in the Luxembourg, listening in stunned silence while she told him of her engagement to Captain Debray. "It is for mother's sake alone," she said sadly.
that I have promised to what this man. Won't you believe me, my dear friend, when I tell you that it is I who make the sacrifice?" She turned appealingly to the Southerner, who was plainly perplexed. "Do you love him, mademoiselle?" asked Cresson earnestly. "I cannot believe that you do, nor do I understand your reason for marriage with the accuser of your brother. Surely your mother does not wish this. Be frank with me, Audrey." Cresson was unaware that he had addressed her by her first name. She toyed with her handkerchief in confusion. "My friend, I despise him," she said feelingly. "Yet I have made mother believe that I love him. It is only because she loves me that she would permit it. Mother is unaware of the bargain. Debre's promised to restore the estate in her name after the ceremony. The wedding is to take place 2 weeks from today. The bans have been published, and alas, I must go through with it." Cresson now realized the nobleness of her sacrifice, and the thought of it made him turn his head and stare dejectedly at the ground. When he glanced again in her direction, Audrey was weeping softly, bitterly, her whole body shaken with emotion. The sight aroused in him that tender sympathy that all men have for distressed womankind. He longed to take her into his arms, to comfort her as he would a child. Yet he restrained the impulse, knowing the utter futility of it. Both attempted to hide the turmoil in their hearts by affecting a mask of gaiety on the return home, succeeding most miserably. Cresson reached his study in a state of dejection. He turned the key slowly in the lock and stopped suddenly. Beneath the door was the yellowed edge of a telegram, delivered in his absence. He stooped to pick it up, and saw that it was from Littlejohn. It read, "Come, expect you, Moncourt, tomorrow." That was all, but it was enough to busy the Southerner with the packing of his bag. End of Part 4. Section 5 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 5. It was well into the following morning when Cresson stepped on to the station platform in Moncourt. He found Littlejohn waiting with a carriage, and together they drove to the inn. The scientist cautioned the younger man that a short nap might be necessary before undertaking the work laid out that evening. Cresson awoke in the late afternoon to find Littlejohn studying a map of the fortress and the known portion of the tunnels. Littlejohn, laying the map aside, gave details of his plan. He explained that he would begin work that night in the haunted guest chamber of the fort, alone, because he did not wish to expose anyone else to danger. Cresson objected vigorously, declaring that he would take chance for chance with the scientist. Littlejohn glanced at him admiringly. "That's what I call grit," he said slowly. "Not one man in 1,000 would go back into that room after an experience such as yours." It was useless to attempt dissuasion, and Littlejohn turned the subject as they walked to Vaux in the waning light of the afternoon. The rays of the sinking sun bathed a desolate scene of pitted hills and scarred ravines, which were crowned by the fortress of Vaux, lighting the low, rakish ramparts a weird red, enhancing the blackness of their shadows. Falaise met them a short distance from the entrance, and the three remained in discussion several minutes before going on. The major seemed paler, more anxious and thinner, it seemed to Cresson, than when they had seen each other last. They listened closely as Littlejohn pointed out the necessity of keeping his and Cresson's arrival as nearly secret as possible. The two dined with Falaise that evening, apart from the others. The major, in a low voice, told them that 2 men had died, and 3 others were hopelessly insane of terror over unseen things within the past week. These tragedies took place on different nights, he said, but on each those in the fortress had plainly heard the whisper. "The whisper of the tunnels, monsieur," said the major, his face ashen. Falaise was intensely interested in the experiment, but declared that not all of the world's gold could persuade him to spend a night in the guest chamber, even with others. It was plain that the major's experience during his 2 years' assignment to the garrison command had shaken him tragically. He bore up only because of the expected transfer, a removal from Vaux to a place where there were neither tunnels nor whispers.
Little John again endeavored to show Cresson the danger that awaited anyone except a trained psychic in coping with unseen forces. The younger man, however, refused to be swayed by this argument. "Many of these tunnels were built before Napoleon's time," said the scientist, "when black magic raged in portions of Europe. Today there are persons in France, adept in the art of producing innate intelligences more terrible than the monster created in the story of Frankenstein. These whispering tunnels and mysterious deaths and insanity among men of the fort may be due to some curse placed on its members by a vengeful sorcerer long ago, one who was in some way harmed in this place. Such curses may rage for hundreds of years after the death of him who called them into being, unless dispelled by a powerful exorcist." Dr. Littlejohn's face grew grave as he concluded. "Keep this in mind, Miles, my boy," the scientist cautioned, "and abide by it. Don't give way to fear in that chamber tonight. If you feel yourself being overcome, fight it. Fight it with all the strength of your will. Do as I tell you, and ask no questions. There is danger enough for both of us, if the forces are of great power. If one gives way under such circumstances, anything may result. Insanity, or even death." The three stood in the corridor just outside the guest room, listening, as a faint sound vibrated through the hush of the corridors, slowly rising and falling, and then diminishing. It seemed faint and far away, deep below the fortress at times, at others, filling the corridors about them with a soft and swishing subtleness. "The whisper," breathed Falaise, his eyes terror-stricken, as he strained his ears with an intentness that stiffened his entire frame. He turned his haunted gaze to his companions only when the sound had ceased altogether. The Major remained with the two Americans but a short time, and reproached himself on departure that he had permitted them to occupy this deserted portion of the fortress, even for a night. Dr. Littlejohn locked the door and gazed about the large irregular chamber, noting silently the long drawn-out shadows, which seemed to take their rise in the corner and creep across the floor. Nor did he fail to observe the shadow above his head, a hovering mist midway between the high ceiling and the floor. It was the omen, regarded by psychics as the certain sign of a spectral presence. The scientist drew his electric torch and set himself to feel after what was really wrong with the room, while Miles Cresson remained seated before the log fire which had been kindled earlier in the evening. As Littlejohn passed slowly around the walls, he gradually gathered impressions, very unpleasant ones. These seemed worst in the anteroom of pepper-box shape, where a sensation of utter loathing and sickness of soul swept over him. He decided that someone in the chamber, though unseen by himself or Cresson, was watching every movement. Littlejohn gazed between the parted curtains for several minutes, then walked to the fireplace to face the Southerner. "Sense anything unusual, Miles?" he asked, wiping his spectacles. "Feel awfully peculiar, Doctor. Can't say why," was the young man's reply. "Keep a cool head, son," advised Littlejohn. "We're in for a night of it, and no mistake. Don't cross the center of the floor. If you find it necessary to move, walk around close to the walls, for in the center of a place such as this, a malignant entity is always most powerful. At the walls it is weakest." Except the flickering shadows, the two men saw nothing in the next 2 hours. It was well past midnight when both heard the whisper, faint at first, but gradually increasing in tone until it became almost a roar in the corridor outside. They exchanged significant glances and steeled themselves for an ordeal. Without warning, the locked door swung wide and a rush of icy air filled the chamber. The gasping roar of air currents deafened them. The lamp was blown out, its flame vanishing in a puff. "Keep your back to the wall!" shouted the scientist, hurling aside his deadened electric torch and flinging Cresson back against the masonry. The fire dimmed as it had done on the previous occasion, and the whirring and flopping of unseen creatures raced about the high ceiling. A long-drawn wail, rising to a shriek, pervaded the chamber, and the fire went out altogether, leaving the room in darkness. Something immense seemed filling the room, something violently hostile and terrible. Globes of greenish-blue light floated through the air and bowled over the floor, and the fetid breath of slobbering things blew against the faces and hands of the Americans. The strangling of dying humans seemed to issue from the anteroom, now lit with a pale, ghastly light. The immense entity was coming nearer. They could feel the approach, inch by inch, of something that threatened to overwhelm them. Suddenly Little John made a mystic sign and pronounced 3 words in an unknown tongue. He ran rapidly around in a wide circle, scattering a powdered substance about the center of the room where the malignant intelligence hovered. When he reached the starting point again, he stepped forward, pouring a drop of liquid from an odd-shaped vessel of brass drawn from his pocket. The circle sprang into flame, lighting the chamber with a blood-red glow. Little John's eyes glittered straight into something ahead, and his whole being seemed transformed as he drew himself erect and poised. His arm circled his head with the brass vessel as he leapt to the edge of the flaming hoop, reciting a staccato chant. "Appear!" the scientist screamed. "Appear! In the name of the Creator, I command you to appear!" A black cloud seemed to fill the center of the red circle. Suddenly both men saw it. A great, shapeless creature was taking the form of a man, so tall that the head was bent against the ceiling. 2 burning, baleful eyes were fixed on the pair as a snarling issued from its great black mouth, lined with long, jagged teeth. The creature's body was covered with scales. Its powerful arms and toes were armed with long, razor-like claws. Little John steeled his will to prevent the thing's efforts to overcome him with the noxious stench it emitted. It was the beginning of a deadlock of wills which lasted for minutes in that room of damp stone. Cresson saw the doctor, like a sorcerer of old, advance toward the thing, his voice rising and falling, chanting the lines of a Latin incantation. The thing retreated a few feet, only to redouble its efforts to close in on the 2 men. Little John made the sign of the cross, stamping his feet as he advanced, bidding the entity be gone in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. There was a wail and a sucking noise as it vanished like a flash through the curtains of the anteroom. The door slammed shut and locked. The fire suddenly leapt into blaze again, and the lamp relit with a clear, steady ray. The flaming circle died out. Cresson had fainted. Little John ran to his side as he recovered, staggering weakly into a chair. The Southerner was deadly pale, and for a few minutes unable to speak. Little John mopped his brow and stood with his back toward the fire. "It has gone out of the room," he said at length, "but it may return any minute. Be on your guard. It is an entity of great power and has not yet completely taken shape. There is no doubt in my mind about it being an elemental, freed by some powerful magician in olden times and set raging by this bloody battleground in the late war. Undoubtedly, black art was practiced in this very room. You must fight against being drawn into the tunnels, for the chances are you would never emerge." The scientist flung himself into a chair, but as he did so, the door opened violently, and again the room was plunged into darkness. Little John placed his back against the wall, but to his dismay, Cresson ran to the center of the chamber, striking and shouting. "Get away! Get away, I tell you! Get away!" he cried. The young man fought like one possessed, but suddenly his voice changed into a booming, reverberating bass which filled the atmosphere with echoes. It sounded now in a low, deep chuckle. Above him, Little John saw the round spots of flame that were the creature's eyes. "Hail, master!" spoke Cresson in deep Flemish. "Hail, all-powerful Prince of Darkness! Lucifer!" The tones were not his, the scientist noted, as the rumbling voice trailed off into unintelligible gibberings. Little John forgot his own safety and rushed to draw the Southerner back. Too late! With a wild shriek, Cresson disappeared at top speed through the door, which slammed shut before Little John could follow. He stood still, as steely claws sought his neck. He drove these back with the force of his thought. There came to the scientist the realization that Cresson had been snatched from the room by a lesser force, while the greater was centering its power on him. Again he threw out his will, quickly drawing from his vest a golden crucifix, holding it aloft as he began the ancient rites of exorcism. As he prayed, he could feel the power of the entity growing weaker and weaker, until at last it dispelled itself as the distant bugles heralded the coming of day. He concluded his prayer with the benediction, convinced that the evil intelligence had vanished from the fort forever. End of Part 5. Section 6 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 6. Little John's first thought was of Cresson as he passed from the chamber. Instinct guided him along the passageway and down dark flights of steps to the labyrinth below, where the whisper sounded faintly in the tunnels. His echoing steps beat a straight course over the never-ending path of moldy flagstones, until at length a white patch of light glimmered in the distance ahead. It proved to be a breach in the tunnel, overlooking the destroyed portion of the fort. The scientist recovered his balance with an effort as he stumbled over the unconscious form of Cresson lying in the opening. He made a hasty examination of the Southerner's body, but found no wounds beyond bruises and cuts. Wrapped about Cresson's ankles was a slender strand of copper wire, which convinced the scientist that his friend had tripped over this while fleeing back into the tunnel to escape some terrible sight. The expression of terror on Cresson's face gradually disappeared as he slowly revived under Little John's ministrations. The scientist supported him as he emerged from the opening in a weakened and nervous state. They decided to return in the open air rather than risk the danger of becoming lost in the tunnels, and finally reached the exterior of the fortress by clambering over the shattered masonry of the ruins. Once more in the chamber, now quiet and peaceful, Cresson recounted his experiences after rushing forth from the room. "Something seemed pulling me," he said, "and it was a force of such power that I could not struggle against it. I was drawn farther and farther into the tunnels and into the midst of frenzied things that filled all space. There was a luminous mass ahead of me, which at length became clearly outlined. I saw that it was Jules Chamont in the vivid blue-gray uniform and trench helmet of the French line troops. He pointed ahead, uttering no word, and I followed on, powerless to resist the force that seemed in possession of my will, through passages and down steps into the bowels of the fort. When we walked out into the ruined part of the fortress, Jules pressed a granite slab, and a large opening in the floor presented itself. We went down still farther into a chamber so large that there seemed no walls or ceiling to it. I followed Jules to the center of the room, and, Doctor, I saw him fade right through it. There came the sound of many soldiers crowding about me until I could feel their breathing, chill as death, on my cheeks. I was thoroughly terror-stricken by this time, but it seemed that I could not flee. Moans, screams, and hissing whispers rang in my ears. A terrific cannonading seemed in progress outside the vault, and the rush of many waters under the flooring where I stood, unable to stir. I saw terror-stricken soldiers, outlined in a bluish light, race madly about the chamber in a veritable dance of death, and a long-drawn call, "Run for your lives!" seemed to undermine my reason. I tore myself free from long, bony fingers that clutched my throat with a strangling grip. I plunged over the flagstones, fighting to clear my way. I reached the steps and ran upwards, only to be dragged back by the bony hands. They seemed clutching my clothing, my limbs, and my hair. Hordes of rats swarmed up the stairs, tripping me as they squealed and fought. I kicked a passage through their scurrying, loathsome bodies, and twice I fell with the creatures streaming over my body to rise and struggle on. It seemed that the whole earth shook with a crashing, blinding roar as I stumbled out of that charnel house. I tripped, fell, and knew no more. Cresson, from sheer weariness, flung himself upon the bed, and was soon in a sound sleep. Little John tiptoed from the chamber, going at once to headquarters, where he sought out Major Falaise. He drew the officer aside with the story of the wire over which Cresson had stumbled in the tunnel. Arming themselves with maps and compasses, Little John and Falaise led a group of 6 men to the tunnel entrance, after descending into the ruins. The men were known for courage, but the sound of the whisper, which suddenly sprang from nowhere, unnerved them to such extent that it took considerable persuasion to force them on. The copper strand was located without difficulty, and the party followed its length back into the fort. They found that the wire ran up a flight of stairs, which ended flush against the ceiling. Falaise put his shoulder against the vaulted roof and pushed upwards. Suddenly an entire section of rock lifted, and the little group emerged into the anteroom of the guest chamber. It was a trap door, the existence of which was unsuspected in the command. The wire, they found, was attached to a blasting battery resting on the top step. Falaise departed in haste to inform Colonel Dupin of the discovery. Little John, in the meantime, led the group back into the tunnel and descended dark stairways, listening intently to the sound of the whisper, which gradually became nearer. The descent carried them to a depth which cobwebs attested had not been sounded in years. The whisper had become a roar as they reached the bottom tunnel, leaving the men in a state of terror. Little John started exploration of the deep tunnel when the fears of the men had subsided. The sound seemed to issue loudest behind an iron door leading off the passage. It took the combined efforts of the 7 men to budge the door, after the rusted bolt had been removed. When it finally slid open, a blinding cloud of steam overwhelmed the little group in the passage, and a hissing sound that was almost deafening issued from the darkness beyond the door. Little John returned to the entrance, thrusting his electric torch inside. At first he could see nothing, but as the hissing gradually ceased, the vapors lifted sufficiently to reveal the lower portion of a great chamber. He sprang back with an exclamation. "A geyser!" he shouted to the men. "After all, the whisper of the tunnels has a logical explanation. There is a crater inside, whose bottom is lined with skeletons. There must be hundreds of them whitening down there. Unquestionably, this pit was a place of execution 100 years ago, where living men were boiled to death by the geyser." Little John ordered the door closed and told the soldiers to follow. In one of the corridors branching from the tunnel, the scientists discovered dozens of dungeons containing rusted iron rings, manacles, and chains. Rotted clothing on the flagstones gave mute testimony that human beings had been imprisoned here. In 3 of the larger dungeons there were racks, screws, burning irons, and other implements of torture. But the most important evidence of the dreadful scenes enacted here Little John found in one of the smaller cells. His torch had swept about the interior, and had fallen upon an inscription in Flemish, scrawled into the stone wall. Translated, it read as follows: "I, Gilbert Savin, of the commune of Verdun, in the year 1791, am doomed to torture by Louis the King for the practice of sorcery. Sorcery, so be it. I leave this dungeon to join Lucifer, my master, in the realms of darkness. In so doing, I bestow my curse upon the king, his hirelings, and the scene of my torture. My familiar, Grothar, created in blood, nourished in blood, shall be awakened by blood to wreak vengeance upon all who dwell here." "Savin!" exclaimed Little John to himself. "One of Europe's most infamous devil-worshippers. Don't wonder that King Louis and his court came to grief with so powerful a curse cast on them." The scientist drew away from the dungeon, satisfied that both the curse and the whisper of the fortress had been explained. The party ascended to the upper tunnels of Vaux, where it disbanded. End of section 6. Section 7 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 7. Little John found Falaise and Cresson awaiting him in the guest chamber. They listened breathlessly as he told the story of his discovery. "It can readily be seen," he explained, "that the geyser below is the source of the whisper in this fortress. It is, of course, intermittent in its action, more active at night because of cooler atmosphere. There seems to be no connection between the whisper and the curse, although it was natural, of course, to associate them, because both were usually active at the same time. The deaths and insanity of men here, in my opinion, occurred from fright. bloodshed so freely here during the war undoubtedly recalled the sorcerer's curse with redoubled power, and the familiar haunted his victims one by one. You need never again fear the whisper, for I have exorcised the curse. Within an hour from the time Falaise had gone from the guest chamber, the Americans were requested to appear before Colonel Dupin. The grizzled commander began chuckling when he saw Cresson, and an amused glint lurked in his eyes. Falaise, who stood by his side, motioned them to chairs.
"Messieurs," said Papa Dupin, "I believe now the story told by Monsieur Cresson of his being haunted in the guest chamber. Major Falaise has explained it. To say that I am grateful for the exercising of the curse of Dr. Littlejohn would not express a small part of the gratitude I feel toward him. I suspected the tragedies here were caused by some curse, but I was powerless to combat it. Peace and contentment will be ours from now on. The esteemed doctor and Major Falaise have rendered another great service. This morning, for instance, they found that a certain copper wire, which Monsieur Cresson will remember as having tripped him up in the tunnel, was connected to a powerful blasting battery beneath a trapdoor in the anteroom. This trapdoor was cleverly built into the floor, no one in the fort suspecting it was there. But someone knew of it during the war, and gentlemen, that part of the fort were supposed to have been demolished by enemy shells was actually destroyed by the deliberate blowing up of its powder magazine."
"You mean blown up?" gasped Cresson.
"Precisely," replied the colonel. "The guilty person must have been a traitor. He must have acted with lightning swiftness, for the enemy had begun the attack that later captured the fortress. Now I believe that the underground vaults beneath the ruins still exist, covered with debris. In this case, the three of you might uncover the evidence we seek. I will hold a detail of men in readiness to clear the ruins tomorrow. Will you do this much for France?"
The three men agreed, thanking him for his confidence. Papa Dupin then turned to Cresson.
"My son," he said earnestly, "Captain Chaumont was your friend, and you are most anxious to clear his name. I, too, am anxious to do this. But we must have evidence more overwhelmingly reliable than that the government now has against him. Let us hope that we may find it."
He clasped the young man's hand, and together the three left the colonel's office. Fully 50 soldiers began digging in the ruins the next morning. On the morning of the third day, one of the men uttered a sharp cry as his shovel bared a heavy iron ring. He scraped frantically, revealing it embedded in a square block of stone, which was fastened with a great sliding bolt, so wedged and bent that sawing it into sections proved the only means of freeing it. The block was removed, and those nearest the trap were almost overwhelmed by a rush of foul air. Falaise ran about excitedly.
"That door was bolted before the explosion," he cried, "by someone on the outside. Men below were trapped like rats."
His excitement increased as the descent down the flight of stairs revealed 2 other traps, similarly bolted. When these were opened, Cresson, seizing a powerful electric torch, sprang down the moldy stone steps. "Little John," he shouted, "it is that same room, the very same that I escaped from the morning you found me." The doctor with difficulty restrained Cresson, for the latter's excitement had gradually increased as the two had begun the descent with Falaise and a group of 6 men. The electric torches of the Americans flashed over the vaulted ceiling, accentuating the shadows and festoons of cobwebs that hung from the stones like long fingers. Far away the searchers heard the rushing of water, which Cresson had described in relating his experience, and it seemed to the group that the sound arose from under the flagstones in a sort of indescribable roar. Suddenly their torches shone on a massive iron tripod, rising from the center of the chamber. "The floodgate controlled!" Falaise exclaimed in awed tones. "The levers are down, and yet neither magazine nor tunnels were ever flooded. The men were thought killed by shells, which destroyed this part of the fort, but this now shows that they arrived here." The officer was plainly puzzled, explaining that the machinery was one of the fort's most powerful weapons of defense before the wing was destroyed. At all times, he said, A detail of men stood in readiness to turn the waters of the Meuse into either the powder magazine or the tunnels, to render them useless to the enemy. A horror-stricken exclamation came from Cresson as the light of his torch fell upon the glint of dull gold from a huddled object on the flagstone. Drawing near, he perceived it to be a skeleton in the uniform of a French officer. A trench helmet lay beside the body, and a short distance away, an overcoat. The sight made members of the party gasp. Cresson stooped swiftly to examine the identifying bracelet about the bony wrist, leaping back with a gasp. "Jules Chamon!" he cried, reeling away from the spot. A shout from one of the soldiers told that another skeleton had been found. Near it lay a third, and not far away others, until the remains of 33 soldiers had been counted. Bending over the remains of Jules Chamon, Cresson gave a startled groan which brought the others running to his side. He pulled a sheaf of papers from the skeleton's belt and held it aloft. "Send for the colonel," he commanded. A soldier raced away, and soon Papa Dupin arrived in the flood vault, excited and puffing. "Bring the papers to my office," the colonel ordered, indicating that the 2 Americans were to follow him. "You, Falaise, post a guard here, and see that no one enters. No one, mind you." He acknowledged the major's salute, and trotted away with Cresson and Littlejohn at his heels. End of Part 7. Section 8 of Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Part 8. Once inside his office, Papa Dupin locked the door and turned up the flame of the lamp. The 3 drew their chairs together as the colonel glanced through the documents hurriedly. He uttered a cry of amazement. "My friends," he said slowly, "the mystery of Fortevaux's betrayal is solved. Jules Chamon was no traitor, poor fellow, but a hero. He and 33 others were sent into eternity by another Frenchman, a traitor, who blew up the fort's magazine from his concealed position in the anteroom. Here, read these." With this, the colonel thrust the thick packet of papers into Littlejohn's hands. The documents included orders, maps, and plans of vital importance to the defense of the garrison. Scrawled on the backs of the documents was a diary kept by Jules Chamon up to the time of his death. On the first document were the lines, "In the event that my body and those of the other men are ever found, I pray that these papers will aid in clearing up the manner in which we died." These lines were written in Chamon's bold style, and on the paper the 3 saw dark stains, doubtless of blood. June 6, 1917. Caught Debray passing this packet of papers to a known enemy spy. How this fellow got inside of the fort, I do not know. He ran at top speed in the opposite direction when I closed in on Debray and confronted him with the evidence of his treachery. The traitor pleaded with me not to expose him. He groveled on his knees. I shook him off, rat that he is. He has betrayed his country, and through him France may lose Verdun, her heart and soul. I went to the commandant's office this afternoon to expose him, but the colonel was not there. Must wait until tomorrow. Debray cannot escape. He knows that I am watching. June 7th, 1917. Only the colonel must hear my story, and this he cannot do this morning, because he is inspecting the trenches outside. Thus does the traitorous Debray gain another day of grace. But what matters this when he cannot escape? He watches me in terror. The Germans are but 500 meters away. How much information Debray has already given them, I do not know. I must stop. The bugles are blowing like mad. There is an attack. Everybody running to positions. Major Callan is shouting out my name and Debray's. We are to take charge of a detail and go down into the flood vault. June 7th, 1917. It is afternoon, and the attack continues. Debray lingered behind. He knew I could not stop to drag him with us. Ah, had I only known his scheme, we should have avoided imprisonment in this dark vault. Debray followed and bolted down the trap after the last man had gone through. We have thrown the flood levers, only to find them sawed from their connecting rods below the vault, where we cannot repair them. The machine is useless. The work of this traitor. Oh, the assassin! He opened the trap a minute ago to tell us to say our prayers, to shout that he means to fire the magazine. He bolted down the trap before any of us could reach him. The papers in my belt, they would incriminate him. June, 1917. A terrible roar, a frightful shock. The whole fort came tumbling down over our heads hours or days ago. We are buried. All of the poor fellows are either dead or wounded. I am covered with blood and can hardly drag myself over the floor. Dying men are moaning and crying for water. There are thousands of gallons of it beneath us, and yet we cannot reach it. There is no food. We are doomed to die like rats. June, 1917. Debray! Traitor! May the curse of dying men rest upon him. I am too weak to move now, and writing is most painful. My matches are giving out. I hope death comes quickly. Have given up hope that we shall ever be found, either by our own men or by the Germans. There is cannonading outside, but here we can only feel a muffled jar. The whole vault seems to tremble. June, 1917. Almost too weak to write. Can only move my hand. No matches. Writing in darkness. Too far gone to get my prayer book under my shoulders. If I could only see the sun shine again. God preserve my dear mother and my sister. Here the messages ended. The last was feebly scrawled, and Little John deciphered it with much difficulty. Death had evidently overtaken Jules Chamont shortly after he replaced the packet in his belt. The papers contained damning evidence against Debray. One was a request from the enemy general, von Mock, for additional information as to the fort's weakest points, and his betrayal yielded Fort Vaux into the enemy's hands an hour after he had fired the magazine. "For the first time, messieurs," said the colonel, "the truth is known. Debray must have wrecked the floodgate control days before he fired the magazine. He would have blown up the magazine regardless of whether Chamont had discovered his treachery, as part of his bargain to aid the enemy. As it was, he saw a chance to carry out his plan, and at the same time destroy, as he thought, the evidence. I think you will agree with me that the statement, 'Dead men tell no tales,' is one of the most ridiculous ever coined." The colonel reached swiftly for pen and ink and wrote out a telegram. It was coded in ciphers known only to the French army, but when translated, it called for the arrest of Debray. "My friends," said Papa Dupin to the Americans, "you have served France well. She owes you an infinite debt of gratitude that she can never repay. But as long as either of you live, there is no favor too great to ask of the French military service, which will ever be at your disposal. Won't you remain a while longer as my guests, now that you have cleared the name of Jules Chamont?" The Americans thanked the colonel, but explained that they must return to Paris without further delay. The commandant shook his head disapprovingly, but embraced them both as they left his office. Outside in the corridor, Cresson experienced a feeling of relief over the prospect of leaving behind this labyrinth of mystery and death. He shivered as he took a long look inside of the haunted chamber. "Our discoveries show us why there happened to be a number of apparitions in this room simultaneously," said Little John sagely. "The anteroom in olden days must have been an altar for devil worship, for the strongest forces issued there. That trapdoor leading to the tunnels must indeed hold a dreadful history. There are hundreds of entities that still rove the distant tunnels, but so far as Vaux is concerned, the malignant curse is gone. The fort was built over ancient underground dungeons where hundreds were put to torture for sorcery up to 100 years ago. Many were the curses placed upon the whole region, and some, as you have seen, are still active." "Don't talk about it, Doctor," pleaded the younger man. "I'm getting all unnerved. Let's get out of these hills." Little John laughed, noticing Cresson's expression of anxiety. "Do you know what day this is?" asked the scientist. "September 7th, of course," replied Cresson. He started suddenly.
The day Audrey is to marry Debray. How could I have forgotten it? He fairly groaned as he snatched his watch from his pocket. 3 o'clock, he exclaimed dismally, and the wedding is at 7. Oh, if I could get to Paris in time, I can't even send her a telegram, for it would be held up by the censors until too late. You do love her, don't you, my boy? Asked Little John, his eyes twinkling with humor and understanding. Cresson started with astonishment as his eyes met those of his friend. How did you know, Doctor? He gasped. Knew it the day after you called in Paris, laughed Little John. You gave yourself away. Little things, you know, all my life I've been an observer. He walked away mysteriously, leaving the Southerner in a state of dejection. 10 minutes later the scientist returned, rubbing his hands together briskly. Get ready for a fast trip to Paris, he exclaimed. Quick trip? Why, Doctor, how? Asked the puzzled Southerner. Airplane, of course, numbskull, answered Little John waggishly. An automobile will call here for you in 10 minutes. Colonel Dupin has arranged everything. A plane awaits you at Gallieni Field. 2 hours later, Cresson was hastening to Madame Chaumont's home in the Latin Quarter. He arrived just as the finishing touches were being made to Audrey's bridal costume, 10 minutes before going to the church, when the ceremony was to be performed. It was most difficult for Cresson to break the news, and for a full 2 minutes he could not respond to the joyous greeting of the two women. But it was his duty, and glossing over the most harrowing details of the story, he told it from beginning to end. Madame Chaumont exhibited remarkable control, but Audrey, who was worn with the ordeal of awaiting marriage with the man she despised, was less able to bear up. She swooned, pale as death, as Cresson concluded his narrative. She recovered consciousness in the Southerner's arms, her violet eyes widening as he pillowed her head of glorious gold on his arm. In one mad moment, Cresson threw restraint to the winds and pressed his lips to hers in a divine moment of bliss. Her arms stole around his neck, and joy surged within him as he felt his kisses being returned. It seemed as if the world stood still to listen to the caroling of a million joyous bird throats. "Oh, Audrey," he breathed, "I love you, can't you see? My happiness is in your hands. My future is yours. Be my wife, dear. Come to America with me, to Louisiana, where your mother and you will know no sorrow again. Forget the past. Awaiting you is the home of my forefathers. It is a great house. It is cheerful, beautiful, restful. The trees and landscape will ever remind you of La Belle France. Have you ever heard of New Orleans, its French patois, its quaintness and charm? Say you will, dear." "On condition," she replied, her eyes shyly seeking his, "that I shall spend 6 months of every year in your beautiful Louisiana, and the other 6 months in La Belle France, always with you. You do not know, Miles, dear woman, what it means to be a French woman, to be exiled forever from her native land. Such a fate would be unthinkable." She nestled in his arms. "Agreed," Cresson shouted happily. "That is a wonderful plan." He lost no time in seeking Madame Chaumont's consent, which she gave with the mingled tears of her blessing. The evening seemed to fly, and the joyous little dinner in a cafe nearby, in honor of the event, seemed over in a flash. In the small hours of the morning, Cresson danced forth from the lift, seemingly on air. He came face to face with Dr. Littlejohn in the entrance. "Why, Doctor," exclaimed the young man, "how did you reach Paris so quickly?" His astonishment was apparent. "Congratulations, son," said Littlejohn, stretching out his hand. "You needn't tell me, I know. I followed you by a fast train, and here I am." "I owe everything to you, Doctor," began Cresson gratefully. "You're the greatest, finest—" "Oh, forget that," laughed Littlejohn. "It was an experience to gladden the heart of any spook hunter in existence. And as the sailors say, you may lay to that." His face grew grave. "Have you heard?" he queried quietly. "About Debray, you mean?" asked Cresson. "Yes," said the doctor. "He was seized by gendarmes while dressing for his wedding. He put up a furious struggle, and for a time the officers had their hands full. He was raging and defiant in the Palais de la Justice until confronted with the evidence. In the end, he signed a lengthy confession. Debray feared death after Chaumont's discovery of his treachery. He waited for an opportunity to shoot the young Frenchman in the back, but this did not come. He had already wrecked the floodgate,
machinery, and had laid wires to blow up the magazine, and his opportunity to effect a double stroke came when Chaumont and the 33 men were sent to the vault during the attack. The death of Major Cowan and the final rush of the enemy left Debray in possession of the secret of Chaumont's whereabouts. None except the Alsatian knew that the anteroom passage existed, and he slipped there during a lull to send part of the fort to destruction with his blasting machine. He resumed his post in the confusion that followed. No one was the wiser save those buried beneath the wreckage. Dying men alone knew that his act had cost them their lives and France its fortress. It was dramatic, Cresson. I reached the Palais just as Debray, coolly smoking a cigarette, was addressing his captors. "Messieurs," he said, "after all, what matters another victim to Madame Guillotine? The world goes on as usual, does it not? My death leaves but one more shade to curse it, and the tunnels of Verdun." Debray's hearers were all so dumbfounded by his cold-blooded confession that for a moment they relaxed vigilance. It was the traitor's opportunity. Before anyone could stay him, the Alsatian had snatched a pistol from the holster of a guard and was springing to the center of the room. He pressed the weapon's muzzle to his temple. The guards ran forward in a confused mass, but too late. The pistol cracked, and Debray crashed to the flags, dead by his own hand. Cresson shook his head slowly, but said nothing. Memories of Jules Chaumont trooped across his vision in a dim procession. Memories of the Vosges, memories of Verdun, Paris of wartime, and Paris of today. Dr. Littlejohn, observing his silence, understood. He pressed the younger man's arm and bade him good night. Walking slowly toward his quarters, Cresson heard, far down the boulevard, the cry of "Extras" being vended by newsboys of the quarter. End of Part 8. End of The Whispering Tunnels by Stephen Bagby.
Thanks for visiting Timeless Audiobooks. Please remember to like, comment, share and subscribe for our latest audiobook uploads.